Hello everyone, my name is Rachel. Welcome back to my channel. Today I am bringing you guys quite the mid-March wrap-up. I have 17 books to wrap up already. At least four of those are novellas. Let's just go ahead and get into it. I have a pretty good mix of different genres going on. So the very first book that I finished was an Audible original audiobook. This is called The Getaway by Sarah Pekkanen and Greer Hendricks. This is the author duo. They're very well known for writing The Wife Between Us and a couple of other mystery thrillers. I've read all of their full-length novels, and I saw that this was on the Audible original library a few months back, and so I just picked it up. Because with Audible originals, you don't have to spend an Audible credit or anything like that. So this is like a 2.5-hour audiobook, very, very short story about this woman, and she finds out about this retreat. It sounds like it's maybe kind of a yoga retreat, maybe just kind of like a mindfulness retreat. And we find out very soon after this audiobook starts that things are not as they seem, and the man running this retreat, he's just crazy. Basically, that's what's going on. And this definitely wasn't terrible. I ended up giving it 3 stars. I don't think it was a complete waste of my time. I don't recommend that you read this yourself. Read their full-length novels. This story was just, it was just whatever. And this month I actually listened to another Audible original audiobook, and that was Once More Upon a Time by Roshni Chokshi. And this is about a prince and a princess. They are from different kingdoms. They get married, but I think on the day that they get married, the princess, I think she gets poisoned by something that she eats, and so she's about to die, and so the prince makes a bargain with this witch that he'll give her anything to save his princess. But basically she makes it so that they forget that they ever loved each other. And so they end up living in this kingdom that it's required that the prince and princess, or the king and queen, are in love with each other the entire time that they rule. So because they're no longer in love with each other, they get kicked out of their kingdom like a year later. I don't know, it's a little bit of a convoluted plot, but basically they strike a new bargain with the witch in order to be able to rule over this kingdom, because neither of them wants to go home back to their families. They're just not having a good time with their families. So it goes on from there. This was really adorable overall. I gave it 4 stars. It's definitely a quest type fairy tale. There were a couple of really cute side characters throughout. Like there's this cloak that the prince has that literally thinks it's a horse. Like, I know that sounds weird and ridiculous when I'm just telling you about it, but it was just so adorable in the context of the story. And there was also this scheming honey badger that they meet. Like, it was just a fun time, you know? Next up, I read Momento. This is by Jay Kristoff and Amy Kaufman. This is a prequel novella to the Illuminae Files trilogy, which is a YA sci-fi thriller series. And this was a very short audiobook. It was only like an hour and a half. And just like with all the other books in this series, I highly, highly recommend checking out the audiobook and the physical or the ebook format at the same time, because there's elements in both that just add a lot to your reading experience. So basically this prequel just gives you more insight into Aiden, which is the artificial intelligence that presides over one of the spaceships that they spend a lot of time on throughout this series, basically. And so I would personally recommend reading this at least after reading Illuminae, which is the first book, because I think you're gonna need a lot of that context going into this prequel novella. I personally think you might be confused if you read this first. So that's my suggestion. Had a fun time. I originally gave it 4 stars, but upon reflection, I gave it 5 stars just because, as usual, the audiobook was just top-notch, amazing production, and I just love the different elements that the physical or the ebook format has as well. Next up, we have This Is How You Lose the Time War. This is by Amal El-Modar and Max Gladstone. This is essentially an adult science fiction romance. This was like a 4-hour audiobook. It's definitely a novella. And to give you the very, very basic plot, we have 2 government agents. This takes place in the far future. We have Red and Blue. Red, I believe, is a cyborg, and she is the agent for one government, and then we have Blue, who is the agent for another completely different kind of government. And so basically both of these governments are fighting to make certain events happen so that for them, their preferred timeline is going to be the timeline that happens. It's a lot to take in, but essentially this is a series of letters between Red and Blue. These letters very quickly turn very romantic, and it's very angsty and forbidden. These two people can't be together, and I really enjoyed this. I ended up giving it 4 stars. This is going to be one of those books that I'm going to have to reread. I might try rereading it at the very end of the month because there's just a lot of things that I feel like I missed. So there were definitely some times throughout this book where I was confused and I wasn't quite sure what was going on, and I had to like go back and reread passages, and I'm still not convinced that I took in 100% of the story. I even had to watch a couple of reviews of this book to make sure that I fully understood what happened at the end, because my God, there's just a lot going on with the ending specifically. Do I recommend this though? Yes, definitely. I think it's a book that you should at least give a chance. I don't think it's a book that's going to be for everybody. The writing style is unique and different, and like I said, the story is a lot to take in, and it may not be for you. The next 2 books I read were by Sarah J Maas. The first one is A Court of Frost and Starlight. This is a novella that takes place after the events of A Court of Wings and Ruin, which is the 3rd book in the original ACOTAR trilogy. And then I also read A Court of Silver Flames, which is the next full book in the series after A Court of Frost and Starlight. So I have a reading vlog where I read both of these books. I will link that vlog up in the cards above. There are absolutely no major spoilers in that vlog. The kinds of things that I discuss in regards to these books are just the characters and their relationships with one another, and I do discuss a little bit the very general plot of this book, but it's nothing that's going to spoil your enjoyment. So don't worry if you haven't read these books yet. You will not be spoiled, rest assured. So I read this novella. This is a book that most people kind of despise, and they think it's a waste of time. I can understand where people are coming from, but if you go watch that reading vlog, you'll know my thoughts about this novella. I personally didn't think it was a waste of time. I just enjoyed being with these characters. Yes, it read a teensy bit like fan fiction, like Sarah J Maas was writing fan fiction for her own characters, but I just had a good time, and I do think that this novella was laying some pretty important groundwork for the next part of this series. So then if we go to A Court of Silver Flames, I discussed this book a lot more in depth than the novella because it's just a lot longer. This is like 750 pages. I tabbed the hecky darn out of it for sure. There are a couple of things that I forgot to mention in my reading vlog for this book that I wanted to mention in this wrap up though. For one thing, this just has a different feel from the original trilogy in a lot of ways. First of all, you can tell that Sarah J Maas was truly given permission to go as adult as possible, because my God, the smut in this book, like, it's probably one of the smuttiest books I've ever read. There's just quite a lot of sex scenes. They're explicit, they're graphic. I think you should know that going into this, because I've seen some reviews on Goodreads where people didn't love this book because of how smutty it was, and you know what? That's perfectly valid. If you're someone that you know that you don't like reading those kinds of stories, I think you might hate this book. I'm just being honest. Now, there is also a plot that centers around the more fantastical elements of the world, basically from the fallout of the war that happened in the 3rd book of the trilogy, and all of that. It centers a lot on Nesta and her healing and recovery from trauma, essentially, and it is the romance between Nesta and Cassian, which was everything. Kind of a grump sunshine trope, with Nesta being the grump and Cassian being the sunshine in a way. Yeah, absolutely fantastic. I also loved that their romance, while this is Nesta and Cassian's version of A Court in Mist and Fury because it's their epic romance story, I like that it didn't follow the same template of Akamath. I also wanted to point out that I found Eris's character to be very interesting. I also forgot to mention him in my reading vlog for some reason. In the original trilogy, he's built up to be a terrible person, but in this book, we're seeing that there's more than meets the eye with him. Now I'm curious to see if he's gonna get like a full redemption arc, and if he's gonna end up being one of the love interests for one of the other characters in this series. I think that this book and House of Earth and Blood Crescent City, it just tells me that Sarah J Maas is in her writing peak at the moment, and it's just so thrilling to see. So obviously I gave this 5 stars, adored it. Definitely check out my reading vlog for more in-depth discussions. I really just wanted to come on here and mention the things that I forgot to mention in that reading vlog. Okay, next one. I'm excited to talk about this one. This is 10 Things I Hate About the Duke by Loretta Chase. This is a book that I randomly found because I read Lord of Scoundrels by Loretta Chase. This was a book that she wrote back in 1993. This is a book that is very beloved in the booktube and romance community, and I really enjoyed it as well. And so I decided to check out more of her recent releases because she's still writing. She has quite the backlist because she's been writing since at least the early 90s. And this is her most recent release. This is book 2 in a series, but I read it as a standalone. You do not need to read the first book. So the plot of this one follows the very basic Tame of the Shrew plot, that Cassandra, our main character, she has a younger sister who wants to come out into society and eventually get married and all of that. But their father is just so done with Cassandra's antics and how she just boldly talks to people, men in particular. She just doesn't care about what society thinks. So he decides to punish both of them by telling Cassandra's younger sister that she cannot court anyone, get married, or anything like that until Cassandra gets married, essentially. And so we have Lucian, who is this duke. He is one of the 3 disgraces that this series follows. They are these 3 dukes that are a menace to society, basically. They just commit all of these pranks all the time. Like, people are just kind of over their shit at this point. And so Lucian and Cassandra were childhood friends, and so that's kind of how they know each other. Basically, their meet cute happens though when Lucian comes out stumbling drunk from an inn that Cassandra's carriage is passing. And he has a gun on him, and he just shoots a gun into the air, and it spooks the horse, makes the carriage fall over, and Cassandra immediately recognizes him and just like goes off on him. And it's just great. It's another Grump Sunshine trope where the heroine is the grump and the hero is more of the sunshiny character. Like, literally, she describes him as looking like a sun god. I love the banter in this book. My goodness, Loretta Chase can write amazing banter. I was just living for it. So witty, so clever, so funny. I also loved this slow burn romance. This is also a great recommendation if you're looking for a romance that is low heat, low steam. There's only one pretty short sex scene at the very end of the book. I thought I would mention that. I don't think that's too spoilery. I think that's good to know. This is also great if you want a low angst romance recommendation because there's no third act breakup once they get together. I think there's like outside forces that are trying to break up the 2 of them, but it's not like they have a huge fight and break up because they've already had plenty of angst before getting together. I also love that this historical romance kind of subverts the trope of you know, a lot of historical romances have like the broody, grumpy hero that falls in love with the more sunshiny heroine, and the hero views it as like an inconvenience that they're falling in love with the heroine, and they see it as being irrational. This book, it's the opposite because Cassandra views herself falling in love with Lucian as an inconvenience and as her being irrational and as her kind of losing her mind. And so I liked seeing that kind of trope be subverted. So clearly I loved this. I gave it 5 stars. I think it is truly a gem in the historical romance genre that more people need to pick up. I need to read more and more from Loretta Chase because I love her writing. Next up, we have another book that I am obsessed with. That is Fat Chance Charlie Vega. This is by Crystal Maldonado. This is a YA contemporary romance about our main character, Charlie Vega. She is plus size. She's Latinx. I'm not going to get too much into the plot, but basically this is all about Charlie truly accepting herself and her body. And she also has a very toxic relationship with her mom. I think that's something good to point out just in case you don't want to read a story about that, because that is pretty central to the plot. There's also some kind of messy teenage drama. I'm here for that. That's one of the reasons why I love reading YA contemporaries. There's an adorable romance between her and this guy, Brian, who is in her art class, and he is just a cinnamon roll soft boy. He's just so freaking adorable, and I love their romance so much. I feel like this book was written for high school me. I can relate to a lot of the things that Charlie feels throughout this book in terms of her body and her existence. It was just, man, she's just so relatable, and I think this is Crystal Maldonado's debut, and it's a fantastic debut. The writing is great. The story's great. I mean, I can't recommend this enough. If the plot sounds at all interesting to you, I had to give it 5 stars. Oh guys, now we have 2 books that really didn't work for me. Okay, first one is When a Rogue Meets His Match by Elizabeth Hoyt. This is book 2 in the Grey Court series. So Elizabeth Hoyt is an author that I've enjoyed in the past. I've read one of her books in her Maiden Lane series. I plan on reading more books in that series soon. I've read one of her novellas. I enjoyed that one as well. I think she has a unique writing style and a unique way of telling historical romance stories. This one was not it. I ended up giving it 2 stars. I thought this one started off really well. Basically, we have a marriage of convenience at the very beginning between our 2 main characters, Messalina and Gideon. And so I think what ended up killing this story for me is that these 2 characters got together and had sex too early on in the story. I think it took away a lot of the sexual tension and a lot of the chemistry between these characters. And so by the second half, I just started getting really bored, and I was just kind of waiting for the story to end. The only reason why I didn't DNF this was because there is a really interesting kind of murder mystery going on. Elizabeth Hoyt does that really well, where she has these interesting mysteries that take place in conjunction with the romance plot. So I wanted to know the resolution to that. The resolution was definitely lacking for me. So I do feel like it was a bit of a waste of my time to even bother finishing this book. So because it started off really well, I'm gonna give it 2 stars. Then the next book I'm gonna talk about really quick is Master of One. This is by Danny Bennett and Jada Jones. This one sounded so good to me. It's essentially about, it's a YA fantasy. Basically, we've got Rags. He is this thief. He gets recruited by this sadistic sorcerer to go find this ancient Fae relic. Turns out the relic is a Fae prince himself, who was kind of frozen in sleep for a couple of 100 years. And so Rags wakes him up, and now they're on this epic quest to find these like 6 relics, these 6 Fae relics. And one of the things that I was loving about this book is how diverse the characters were, because we've got Rags and the Fae prince, I think his name is Shining Talon. There is a male-male romance between the 2 of them, and then there was also a transgender actress in their group. There was also a disabled character. Like, there's a lot of amazing things going on for this story. Unfortunately, the writing really bogged down my reading experience. I ended up DNFing this at 57%, and where I left off, there was still no real inkling of the romance between Shining Talon and Rags, and so I was just over it. All right, next up, I read the final book in the Succubus Blues, or the Georgina Kincaid series by Rochelle Mead. This is Succubus Revealed. Wow, was this an incredible conclusion to the series. My goodness. There's a lot going on. This is only like 280 pages, but there's a lot jam-packed into this book, and I thought that it was all done so well. This plot takes a turn towards the end of this book that I feel like if other authors had attempted it, it wouldn't come off as well as it does when Rochelle Mead writes it. And by the end, like literally the last 3 pages, I was bawling my eyes out crying. Oh my goodness. And throughout this whole series, this angsty forbidden romance between Georgina, who's a succubus, and Seth, who is a human, it's been ripping my heart out the entire time. And, you know, getting the conclusion to all of that in this book, it was just giving me all the feels. And I can't recommend this series enough. It's just a fantastic paranormal romance adult series. Next up, I read Indigo by Beverly Jenkins. This is a book that I meant to read in February, but my loan from Libby for the audiobook didn't come in time for me to read it then. So I read it recently, and this is a historical romance that is very much beloved by Beverly Jenkins. This might be her most popular book. This was written in 1996. This takes place leading up to the Civil War, I would say. I think around like late 1850s into the early 1860s. And so we are following our main character, Hester. She was rescued from slavery when she was a child. The reason why it's called Indigo is because her hands and feet are stained from working with the indigo when she was a slave as a child. And then we have our hero Galen, and basically both Hester and Galen are working for the Underground Railroad at this point. Galen gets very seriously injured, and so now Hester has to take care of him basically. And things don't start off well between these two characters. Galen's just very grumpy about getting hurt in the first place, and for whatever reason he's just not very nice to Hester at first, but things very quickly change between the two of them. Galen is also white passing. I think he's technically Creole. He's from Louisiana. He lived in France for quite some time. So there's a lot going on in their romance in that they're from two very different worlds. Galen is definitely of higher class than Hester, so that goes into a lot of the angst of this romance. Also, Galen reminds me so much of Prince Naveen from The Princess and the Frog, because he also has a French accent. He has that swagger to him. He's also very, you know, very high class. So yeah, I really enjoyed this one. I ended up giving it 4 stars though. For me, it wasn't quite as amazing as some of the other novels that I've read by Beverly Jenkins. I think that I just wasn't as engaged in the last like 30% or so of the book as I was in the beginning, but I still think it's a great book. It's a great story. Highly recommend checking it out for yourself. I definitely understand why so many people love this book so much. Next up, I read Wildfire by Ilona Andrews. This is the 3rd book in the Hidden Legacy series. This is technically the conclusion to the first trilogy in this series. This is an urban fantasy / paranormal romance series, by the way. And while I don't think I enjoyed this one quite as much as White Hot, which is the 2nd book, I still really enjoyed this story and gave it 5 stars. I think it was still a fantastic way to conclude this trilogy that's centered around Nevada and Connor, because the next part of the series is going to center around Catalina and Alessandro. So I still had a fun time. I think maybe where the plot went wasn't as entertaining to me as the previous 2 books that I read, but still fantastic. I love the romance between Nevada and Connor, and the way that Ilona Andrews writes together, because it is a husband and wife author duo. Like, I just am so obsessed. I cannot wait to read the other books that are out in this series, and then I need to check out their Kate Daniels series as soon as possible. And with that being said, that's going to be it for my mid-March wrap-up. I would love it if you would leave a comment down below if you want to talk about some of your favorite books that you've read this month as well. And yeah, with that being said, I would love it if you would leave a like and subscribe, and I thank you in advance if you do, and I will see you guys in the next video. Bye!